Hey class, in this video I'm going to be talking about scene management. This is a concept that's going to be useful as our programs start to get bigger and more complicated and as we start to add more components. We'll be working with the project 1 that we've been working on so far this semester. In this video I'm going to be adding different scenes to handle different components of our game or scene or application. And in the next video I'm going to be going over some basic physics to create like a simple game. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to open up GitHub to start, and everything looks good, so I'm going to go ahead and click show in Finder, and I'm going to be continuing to work on project 1-4, so we'll be adding more to this project. So I'm just going to duplicate that folder and increment the number there. So on the Mac I'm going to hit Command D and just change this to 1-5. You can also hit Command C, Command V to copy and paste, or Control C, Control V on the Windows. So once you have that set up, let's go ahead and drag the MMP 310 onto the Sublime icon. And I'm going to just be editing my files in this one. So I'm going to open up sketch.js and I'll increase the font size a little bit here. I'm going to be using the collapse functionality to kind of make it a little bit easier to see everything here. So I'm just gonna get rid of some of these extra spaces. So if you've never done that before, there's just like these little arrows next to the numbers in Sublime if you have like an indented function or piece of data or something like that. So I'll be doing that. So in this video, we're going to be adding a bunch of new functions. Last week, we added the sign function to kind of handle the sign functionality. And in this week, we're going to be dividing our program up into different sort of like main scenes to handle different parts of the game. This is a very common thing that's done not only in games, but in pretty much any type of interactive program. So even if you have like a really simple application, you're going to have to know what to show the user. So even something like, the GitHub desktop, like the only reason they know what to show me is because I have MMP 310 selected. If I choose a different repository, they have to show me different information. And so knowing kind of where we are in our application or what scene we should be on is a very important component of programming. P5 even has a dedicated library for this. So I'll go ahead and open my browser and show that real quick. We're not going to use this because we're going to kind of learn how to do a simpler version on our own. But if you do go into the libraries and scroll down a bit, you'll see that there's actually a P5 scene manager. And it's actually a really convenient library. You can see what it does is it basically breaks your scenes into different functions that have their own setup and draw. And it's using a syntax that's probably not very familiar to you, but we are going to cover a very similar syntax in a future video. And so we're going to be creating kind of our own, much more simplified scene manager in this video. As we go through the semester, we'll introduce more sophisticated ways to manage our scenes and our programs. Our sketch in this video is going to get a little complicated and confusing. I'll try to make it kind of as simple as possible, but are going to be a whole lot of functions in this one file. One thing that we'll do as we move forward is start to use different files to organize our code. So I think this week is probably the last time we're going to have enough or small enough of a code base, or we'll have few enough sort of lines of code that we'll want it to be in one file. But we're already up to 123 lines of code here, and we'll probably be adding a bunch more today. So once you get up to that point, you start to think, okay, maybe I need to organize this a little bit better, and we will talk about better organization tactics and strategies, as well as new concepts that are going to help us organize our code in future lessons. So let's talk about basically what I want to do in this video is I want to have different scenes. So I'm going to go ahead and start the Sublime server. Looks like it's already running. So let's go to localhost 8080. And I haven't added this link yet, so I'm going to just type it in here, project 1-5. And so this is kind of our main scene where our character can walk around. And right now, nothing else really happens. So we're going to add a couple things into the scene. One is some functionality where when I click on these different signs, I'm going to enter a sort of like game world. So that's just one example. Keep in mind that you can have the signs do different things. Like they could go to a different scene with different scenery. It doesn't necessarily have to go into the game world. It can go kind of wherever you prefer it to go. So keep that in mind as we go through the video, that like I'm creating a specific example, but there's a lot of different ways to apply the same ideas to different projects. So I'm gonna make this window a bit bigger and open up the console. So that's one thing we're going to do, is we're going to give the character the ability to kind of go into these different scenes, but then we're also going to have to start to think about the sort of user process for going through a game. And again, this applies to any different type of application. We're using a game as sort of a simple example. So when the user starts the game, they appear on this kind of like map scene. That's going to be our main scene. Or we could call it like our map. And the way I'm going to set it up is that when the user goes to one of these signs, it'll prompt them to hit a button to play, an arcade style level where they're going to be jumping over obstacles. And so those are going to be kind of our game scenes. So that's another scene that we have. With the game scene, there's different things that can happen, and we need to give the user prompting so they know what to do. So one example is that they can lose the game. Okay, so if they lose the game, we don't want to just throw them back to the map without explaining what happened. You really need to explain to the user what's going on as they're playing the game. So if we lose the game, we're going to show like a little scene that says, you lost, and if you hit this button, you can start over. The other thing that can happen is they can win the game. So even if they win this little arcade section of the game, we still need to tell them that they won the game. Or, there's other ways that we could show them, like adding, points to a score or something like that. But we do need to kind of do something to signal the fact that something's changing. So this is something that we have to keep in mind when we're building a game, or really any type of application, that while the program might know, where the user is or other things like that, the user doesn't know that unless we represent it to them. So for example, with our character, we know in our code where the character is because we have a couple of numbers that represent that idea. We know the X value and the Y value. But that doesn't really mean anything to the user. What the user sees is the character on the screen. And so even though when I, kind of move my character around, these numbers are changing. So if I move the character down here, now those numbers are different values, and our computer can keep track of that very easily. But what we're actually showing to the user is not, the number 727 and 802. That doesn't really mean anything to them. What we're showing to the user is the actual drawing, but we're using those numbers to tell our canvas where to draw that character. So we need a lot of different things that communicate between what's happening on our program and what the user sees. So one of those things is we can use text and other ways of prompting the user to understand, you won this component, you got this many points, you can hit a button to do this. This is something that's really important for games, but anything that's interactive has the same issues, where we really need to help the user understand what they're supposed to be doing and how to do it at any given moment in the process of using the application. In our simplified version of a scene manager, what we're going to do is we're going to use our draw function as kind of just our main function, and we're going to use a scene manager to decide what we're actually drawing. And so that's actually just going to be a variable, and we're going to save different names in that variable. And when we change the name, then the draw function will know what scene to draw. So for example, I'm just going to create the variable scene, and I'm going to set it equal to main to start. It really can be anything. You could easily call this map or story scene 1 or whatever is happening in your game. And I only have to set this once because the scene is only ever, one scene at a time. We can't show two scenes at the same time. So you might want to make some notes here about what the other scenes are. So for me, my other scenes are going to be a game scene, a win scene, and a lose scene. So those are the other possibilities, but I'm only going to be able to set my scene to one thing at a time. So I'm going to use main as the scene name. And really I could call this anything, but it's good to use something that describes what the scene is being used for so that other developers will understand what's happening. My draw function is really kind of the main scene at this point. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and change the name of the draw function to main. So that'll be my main scene. I'm going to be drawing it, most of the time, except for when the user goes into these other side kind of arcade scenes. So I have my main scene. I'm going to move this sign function down below the main scene. So we'll close that for the moment. And so now I have my main function here. And now I'm going to add the draw function to decide when to draw the main scene. So I'm going to reintroduce my draw function because I do need that. I'm going to say function draw. And the draw function is really going to be very simple. It's basically just deciding which scene to draw. But because P5 is always looking for that draw function, that's what I'm going to be using sort of as my scene management function. So I'm just going to put a comment here that says scene manager. And this is a simplified version, but essentially all I'm saying is if scene equals main, then we're just going to call that main function. So basically we're just saying if it's the main scene, we're going to call the main function and we're going to do everything that was in our draw function. So to start, this really isn't going to change anything that's happening in my project. The scene is exactly the same. It just has a different name. And now we have the ability to draw a different scene. So from here, I'm going to have a series of else if statements. So I'm actually going to go to the next line here just to make it a little bit easier to read. But this is a bit unconventional. So the next scene I'm going to have is like my game scene. And I haven't built this yet, but just as an example, what I would do is I would call the game scene. And so now what I can do is have some interaction in the scene bring up the game scene. So that's what we'll set up in a moment. For now, I have my function main. I'm going to go under here and just put function game. And I'm going to put a little comment here that just says scenes or scene functions. Okay, so we know that, these are the scene functions. These are kind of like my main functions up here. I have my scene functions, and then down here I'll have some game object functions. These are just different things that are in the game. So right now I have a sign, but in the next video I'm going to add what's called an obstacle, or basically like an enemy in the game. So for my function game, it's going to be pretty similar to the main function in some ways and different in others, but we can draw a background to start. I might make this background a different color just so we know that we're in the game. So maybe I'll go with a light blue color. In the game, I'm eventually going to have like a ground, so maybe I'll draw that as well. So I'll draw a rectangle from 0, and let's say height minus, I'm just going to go with like 200 here, and then draw all the way to width, and I'll make the height 200. And I'll say no stroke, and fill is, let's say, light green. So I'm just going to create kind of like a little scene here. You're not going to see anything when we start, but because I have the console over here, this is really nice for, changing things as a developer. I can go ahead and set the scene to game right here. And there we see our game scene. So obviously the user, when they're playing the game, is not going to have access to this. So that's not how it's going to happen when they switch to the next scene. But just as for testing, I can change the scene over here. So now I can set the scene back to main, and now I'm back at the main scene. And one thing that's nice about this is I can actually change the scene up here. So if I'm working on the game scene and I don't want to have to like load it every single time, I can just go ahead and change that scene to game. And as soon as I reload my browser, that's what I'm going to see. But right now I'm actually working on the main scene, so I'm going to switch that back to main. That was pretty simple. I'm going to add a couple more scenes in here that will add different functions for later. And eventually we'll add the ways that we connect to these different scenes. As I mentioned earlier, I have 4 basic scenes. I have the main scene where the character walks around and finds these other scenes. And then I have my game scene, which is mostly going to be the same. It's going to be this arcade style running game. But there are going to be small differences, which we'll introduce with arguments. And then if the player wins or loses, I need a scene to handle both of those cases. So I'm going to add those scenes now. So I'll be done with my draw function. So I'll say else if scene equals win. Then I'm going to call the win function. Else if scene equals lose. I'm going to call the lose function. So a couple of things to mention. It's really important that I'm using the else if here rather than just a bunch of if statements, because the way that P5 works, this draw function is always going to be running. And if we have something set up where it starts to draw the main scene, but then the character, moves to the game scene, but the main scene is already rendered, we might see some weird glitches where we end up in, a different scene than we expected to. So we only want to draw one scene per draw function, and an easy way to make sure that we don't draw more than one scene or have two scenes interacting at the same time is to use else if functions here. You can collapse these a bit if you want it to look a little bit shorter. That's absolutely fine. I was leaving these like this just so we can see each scene on a different line, but people have different preferences for that. And you can see that in each case my scene name matches my function. That's also something that doesn't have to be the case. You can name your functions whatever you want. It just has to correlate. So if this is what you expect to be the win function, then they have to match. So pretty simple. So I'm just gonna make my win and lose functions really quickly, and then we'll update them a little bit later. So I'm gonna add function win, and I'm just gonna add some text here. It's actually gonna go over the previous scene, so I'm not even gonna draw like a background or anything. I'm just gonna say you win, and I'm gonna put that in the middle of the canvas. So I'm gonna use width over 2 for the X and height over 2 for the Y value. And later we'll add some functionality so that we can go back to the main scene. And then I'm going to add function lose. And this is literally the same scene. Okay, so you could actually, you might be thinking, why don't I just make one scene with an argument? And that makes a lot of sense. Maybe I'll do that later on as an example. So for the lose scene, I'm just going to say you lost. And I can test to see if those scenes work. So I'll just change the scene. So the scene is game, the scene is win. Oh, and actually I want to make sure the text is a little bit bigger here. So let's say the text size is 100 and the fill is, I'll go with white for now, but that might be too big. And so now I'm actually thinking, okay, the win and the lose scenes are pretty much exactly the same thing. So why do I have two scenes? I don't know. I might change that later, but let's just keep going. Okay, that looks fine. And so if we go to you lose, we're not drawing a background. So let me go back to the game scene and then go back to you lost. Okay, so I'll add some instructions there later for what to do once that event occurs. But I think that's all of our scenes. And so you can see we can, using our developer tools, we can change between the different scenes. And so if you wanted to add like, a sad face or a happy face or something like that, some other type of reaction, you don't just have to have the text here. You could use an image or an animation as well. Really anything you can draw in P5, obviously you can put inside of a function. So whatever you want to do to represent to the player, and you might not even be working with win and lose states, you might just be working with more components to your narrative. So it's really up to you guys in terms of what you see in these scenes. So now we have to look at how are we going to actually have the user move between the different scenes. And so what I'm going to do is make a simple interaction in the main scene that's going to load the game scene. And eventually, in the second video, when I actually add the game dynamics, we'll figure out how to use the win and lose functions. But I'll add simple functions just to change them in there. Okay, so for our main function, basically what we want to happen is when the player clicks on a sign or hits enter on a sign or something like that, we want them to enter in this arcade game. And so I need to add some instructions for that, and I'm going to change up the text a little bit. So when I made the text to start, I was just kind of filling in some random stuff, but I'm going to make it a little more specific. So for the first sign, which is actually the start here sign, I'll put this at the top since it's the one that we usually see first. It doesn't really matter what order they're in because the X and Y position, as long as those are the same, they'll be drawn in the same place. What we want to happen is when the player actually, runs into the sign and hits a key, that's what's actually going to trigger the character going into the scene. The way we're going to organize it here is a little confusing because their functionality is going to be in two different places. We're going to look at way better ways to organize our code in future classes. This is kind of just an example for how we do this functionality, and then doing it the wrong way, or a simplified way, is sometimes actually a good way of understanding why doing it the right way, even though sometimes it looks a little crazier code-wise, is actually a lot better in the long run. So it's a little bit of a twisty, turny way of teaching, but I do think it helps to kind of solidify, like, I was doing this thing one way because I didn't understand this other thing, but now that I understand these different functions and different stuff, I can see why this is a better way to do it. So I'm gonna just call this like, well, in my scene I have like different obstacles, so I'm gonna call this like snake world or something like that, because I made it like a little snake, which we'll add in the next video. But again, for you guys, you should do whatever fits into your scene for this. And so I'm just going to work with this first sign for now. So I'll put like a little enter here. So it's going to say snake world, and then we're going to add some instructions. These instructions are going to be the same thing for all the signs. So I'm not going to put them as an argument. Since the sign function, any functionality that's the same, I want to make sure that the sign function works the same way in each case. So I'm gonna go down to the sign function. See, now I have a lot of code. I'm like scrolling up and down all over the place. So that's another thing that we're gonna fix as we go through the semester, is how to organize our code better into different files, so we're not just like searching for everything all the time. Anyway, here's my sign function. Actually, in Sublime, a good way to do that, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but if I'm like, okay, where's this sign function? I can hit Command R, and it's a little confusing because Command R is usually like refresh, but in here it actually is like a search functionality. So if I type in sign, it'll show me like all the different things that have sign in them. And so I can click on the sign image and it'll bring me down there. So that's just Command R. So here's our sign, and this is what we're going to show if we're colliding with the character. So I'm actually going to make this part a little bit bigger, and I'm going to make a second text under the first text. So I'm going to make this a bit smaller, text size 16, and I'm going to just say, I'm going to choose a button. So I'm going to say hit enter to, I guess hit enter to enter sounds weird. I'm going to say hit enter to play. Use whatever makes sense for you here. And then I'm going to use the same X and Y. Oh, there's a lot of, I forgot how long this thing is. It's a little annoying. I'm just gonna try X and Y and see what it looks like, and then I'll change it if I need to. That looks good enough. If I see something that looks bad, I'll change it later, but that looks fine. The player's not gonna necessarily know that they have to hit enter to do this. Let's actually put it a little bit farther down. So I'm gonna say like on the Y, I'm gonna say like plus 20. I need to give the user a prompt so they know what to do. They're not just gonna know to hit enter. So we have the text there to show the player to hit enter. Obviously, if I hit enter, nothing happens. So that's the functionality that we need to build in. But we also need to remember any functionality that exists has to be represented to the player in some way, or else they won't know that it's there. So that's going to go right here. So let's just say the enter event. And so we're going to use the same event function that we used for the arrow keys. So we're just going to use key is down, and then I'm pretty sure there is actually, let's check the reference under key code. I'm pretty sure they actually have enter as well. Yeah, they have enter as well. We already are in this collision, so we're already like on the sign. We know that the character is on top of the sign, and we're showing the text. And if we're also hitting the enter key, so we'll say key is down is enter. So if we're also doing that, then we're going to set up the game scene. So one thing that I really want to avoid doing is doing a bunch of stuff here, like, okay, so we hit enter, so we have to change the character position and change the character animation and do all this other stuff. Really what we want to do here is just have a function, because this event is buried inside of this sign function. It's not really like part of our main game logic, and we are going to fix that in the future. But for now, what we're going to do is we're actually just going to add another function to set up the game. So I'm just going to use a function called setupGame. I haven't actually written this function yet, but that just means that, you know, we can get out of this like sort of buried code really quickly and just make a setupGame function somewhere up here. I'm gonna collapse these functions real quick. So I'll put that, you know, next to my game function. So any changes that we want to make here, we can handle in that function instead of having to find this event every time we want to change something. So I'm going to go back up here and I'll put this before the game. It's sort of not really a scene function, but it's related. So I'm just going to put it right here. So setupGame. So this is going to do a bunch of different stuff, but ultimately the main thing that it does is it changes the scene to game. Okay, so that should work for now. So if I go over here and I hit enter, then we're in the game scene. The nice thing about this is that it works on the other signs as well. So I haven't updated the text yet, but if I go over here, it still says enter to play, and if I hit enter, it still goes to the game scene. And so one thing that I can do with the signs is change, you know, some argument here if we want to have different scenes that we go into. So we could say setupGame, or we could just say change scene and then give it, you know, a scene to go to. So if you're not using like arcade game elements, you might just have, you know, setup next scene and then give it an argument here. It could be game, or it could be like scene 2, or, you know, whatever else is in your function. So remember that you can use arguments here as well. And since there are different signs, that would probably become one of the main arguments for the sign. So we do have to kind of like think a little bit about the flow of the different pieces of information. Another thing that gets a lot simpler when we start to use objects in a few weeks. But yeah, so that's anything that we want to do to set up the game, we can do right here. So let's do a couple of those things real quick. So one thing that we're going to want to do is change the player. So let's actually build up the game scene a little bit, and then we'll finish the setup game. So I'm going to change the scene to game. Okay, so one thing is we want to like have some stuff that's similar. So I have these like clouds in my main scene right here. These are all my clouds. I guess I need a comment here, clouds. And you know, I can have these in the main scene as well as the game scene. So one thing, you know, you're probably thinking, oh, I'll copy and paste and just throw it in the next scene. But then we're like changing the code a lot, or repeating the same code a lot. And if I want to make simple changes, I have to do everything over again. So a better way to do this is just add this to a GameObjects function. So it's a little complicated. Now I'm kind of like throwing code all over the place, but let's just make a new function to draw clouds. So I'll call this clouds. And so instead of copying and pasting this into my other scene, I'm just going to copy and paste it down here into my clouds function. And I don't really have to do anything else. That's a nice thing about functions, is I just have to remember that name. So now instead of drawing the clouds with a for loop, I'll just call the clouds. And the trees, I might repeat those, I might not. For now, I'm just going to leave them. So I'll collapse my main scene again. And so here's our game scene. We're drawing our background. So now let's just draw some clouds as well. And since that's like a separate function, now I can call it from anywhere I want. So now our game should have some clouds. And, you know, they're still in the main scene as well. So that's kind of nice. You might not want them to like be in the exact same place. So you could like reset the numbers or something like that. But just as a basic demo, this is pretty good for what I want to do. So now I have some clouds in my scene. So another thing I want to do obviously is draw the player. So I'm gonna draw the same player in this scene. I'll go over it more in the second video, or he's not gonna be standing anymore. He's always gonna be running. So I'm just gonna draw the Jerry walk, and I'm gonna draw it at Jerry X, Jerry Y. And we'll add another animation. So there he is. You know, he can't move in this scene because our keyboard controls are actually only in the main scene at this point. So that's another thing we could move around. If you need your character to move in every scene, you can make another function just for the movement and apply that in every scene, just like I did with these clouds. But for now, those movement function, all these if statements are still just in the main scene. So we can't move him yet. And we're not actually going to move him the same way, so I'm not going to bother copying those over here or making a function. One thing that I do want to do is put Jerry kind of like on the ground that I have here. And so I have this like height minus 200. I want to have that be like a variable, so I'm not just kind of guessing. So I'm going to make a variable for the ground. So I'll put this up here. I'll say variable ground y. And so that's 200. I don't know the height yet, but I do know if I just use that formula, that'll be fine. So I'll say height minus 200, and this is ground y. Okay, that's good enough. And so then I'm gonna reset Jerry's y value. So Jerry y is where Jerry is drawn, and this is a bit tricky. So I'll go over this real quick. So we have our main scene over here. And one thing that we have to be careful with games and with all applications is, let's say we have our character here and he clicks on this sign and he goes, that sign, you know, sends him to this game scene. And let's say in the game scene, he's like running, jumping around, and eventually let's say he like ends up over here. Okay, so he's not in the same position. So if we then just like win the game or whatever, and we immediately teleport back to the main scene, we have to update the Jerry X and Y again. So we don't want Jerry to be here. We want him to be back where he was when he left that scene, right? We need, in order to create that kind of continuity, if you leave one part of the game and go to another, when we come back, we don't want to be down here because it's going to be obvious to the user that, you know, we just moved. We want to be back in the original place. So Jerry X and Jerry Y are always going to be where we're seeing Jerry at that specific frame in our game. If we want to remember where Jerry was for later, we need some new variables. So we'll make like a main X and a main Y, and we'll set those to wherever Jerry is when he leaves this scene. And then when he comes back, you know, we'll throw him in here. So we are adding some more variables here, but you know, we'll figure out better ways to do that in the future. So so I have Jerry Y, Jerry X. I'm going to add Jerry main X, Jerry main Y. And so to remember where Jerry was, the first thing I'm going to do when I set up the game is I'm going to save his current position. So I'm going to say Jerry main X equals Jerry X, Jerry main Y equals Jerry Y. And then I'm going to set Jerry to where I want him to be. So Jerry X, let's put him at like 200. And Jerry Y, let's put it at height minus ground Y. And so now when we change scenes, so let's go back to the main scene so we can see this actually happen. Okay, so now if I'm walking around and I hit enter, okay, so now he's where I want him to be. If I go back to the main scene, he's not just gonna magically go back to where he was. So we need to fix that. So when we go back to the main scene, we need to remember to use the X and Y variables. I think that's all I need to add for the game scene for now. We're going to add the actual game mechanics in the second video for this week. So we're going to introduce some simple physics to create a really simple, just like jumping game. But for now, I think I'm good with this. So the last thing I want to do is create the win and lose conditions. And so those are basically pretty much the same thing. And so what I'm going to do is really similar to what I did with the sign. I'm just going to say, you know, if the key down is enter, then we go back to the main scene. So we'll add that in here. And again, we need some instructions. So I'm going to reduce the text size again. Let's say it's like 50. And text is, so one thing that we're going to see is an issue. I'm going to say hit enter to return to map. And I'm going to put this at width over 2, just like the win text, and height over 2 plus 100. And then if we say hit if key is down, enter. Okay, so same thing for when we're above the sign. Then we can go back to the main scene. So I'm just going to say scene equals main. Well, actually, I want to do some other stuff in here. So let's say setup main. So we're going to end up with a bunch of different setup functions, which again, we'll simplify later. So we have our setup game. Let's say function setup main. And so we want to return Jerry X to the main X, Jerry Y to the main Y. So we're just going to do the same thing except reverse. So I'm going to put this in here. X is X, Y is Y. Put main X here, main Y here. So we're going to return Jerry, and then we're going to say scene equals main. And we're going to see a problem here, which we'll fix in a minute. We're walking around with Jerry, hit enter, we're playing the game, and eventually we're gonna win. So let's say scene equals win. Okay, you win, hit enter to return. Doesn't look like that text size worked because I didn't write it all out. So text size. Okay, hit enter to return to main. So I'm gonna hit enter, and we went right back to the game scene. So you probably saw it flash for just a second, but here's the problem. And this is a really important thing to go over when designing a game, or really anything that's interactive, is we have to keep track of these scenes, and there's a lot of like little places where we can slip up. So when I hit enter, what's gonna happen, it's kind of confusing, but right now the scene equals win. But if you remember, the main scene, as soon as we hit enter, what's gonna happen is we're gonna set up the main scene. So we're gonna turn Jerry back to where he was. He's still going to be over this sign, and we're going to immediately go through the main function, and that's going to detect that our enter key is hit and we're above the sign, and so we're going to go right back into the game scene. The issue here is that we're holding the key, and all P5 is really asking is if the key is down. So if the key is down when we're in the win, then we go back to draw and we're in main, then we go through all of our main code, and we're immediately going back into the game scene because we're above the sign. So there's a few ways to fix that, and they're all kind of complicated. One is we use, the function mouse or key pressed, and so that waits for the key to come up before it does anything. So we could use a function like key released, but that's just a function, so we'd have to have like a whole other set of logic there, and so we'd have to have logic that's parallel to what's actually happening in our scene. So that gets a little bit complicated. The easiest thing to do here is actually just change the key that we're using for the time being. It's not the most elegant way to do this. For now, since our focus is just to keep things simple, I'm just gonna change this key. So I'm gonna say hit M to return to map, and then instead of enter, we'll get the key code for M. So I can do that by going to keycode.info and hit M. M is 77. So I'll put 77 here. So now we don't really have to worry about that issue, because when I go to the game, once I win the game, if I hit enter, nothing happens. If I hit M, then I'm back in the main scene, but I'm not hitting enter, so we're not going back into Snake Worm. So that's a really simple kind of way to fix this issue for now. I'll put a M key comment here. We basically need to do the exact same thing with the lose scene. So I'm just going to copy this and paste it. But for our lose scene, we're not going to go back to the map. We're going to play the game again. So I'll hit R to try again. And so instead of setting up the main, I'll set up the game again. And so these functions are a little bit different, so it's good that they're in different places. And let me just get the key for R. It's 82. So that's the R key. And so now if I'm playing the game and I'm running around and then I lose, I'll go to the lose scene. And so if I hit R, then it'll refresh the game scene. So one of the things that's kind of frustrating about building games is you want to focus on the jumping and the flying and the bad guys and drawing all the graphics and stuff. But a lot of what you're doing coding-wise is just managing these really basic interactions that you never really think about when you're playing a game. Like a really good game, you don't have to think about that much, like, okay, I hit enter to start, I hit, the mouse to jump or whatever it is. But a really good game has to do all those things, and it has to let the user know how to do them. So a lot of building software, whether it's an application or a video game or anything else like an app on your phone, a big part of that is understanding what the user's looking at and how to prompt them to do the thing that they want to do. So getting them from like you won back to the map, getting them from you lose back to the game, keeping track of their position, all of these really little things that you never think about when you're playing the game or using the application are really important for how an application works. So I think I've covered everything in the scene manager. We're up to 218 lines of code, so we're getting pretty heavy in our sketch.js. So hopefully you guys don't get too bogged down with scrolling up and down and changing things. We have our scene functions area, our game functions area, and then our setup preload area. So yeah, in the next video, I'm going to be adding like a bunch of game physics to our game section. So our sketch.js file is going to get even bigger and unwieldier. So that's why, in future lessons, we'll be starting to break this code apart into different sections. But I think it's simple enough for now that we can keep this going. So let me just change this to 1.5. And this is scene management plus game scene. So I'll do the game scene in the next. So I'm just going to commit this stuff so I have it up to date. So added scene management and commit to master and then push to origin. So I'm just going to leave that there. In the next video, I'll go over adding the thumbnail and the link as well as usual, but we're not quite done with this section, so I'll wait to do that until the next video. So that's it. Let me know if you have questions.